to conclude, given that scientific experiments have proven these claims to be wrong, that we will have to accept the conclusion of the science on these points. So what we find is that in Buddhism there is an understanding of a conception of a cosmology where the evolution of physical universe is understood in terms of the processes of the four elements, the fire, water, wind, and earth. And if one can sort of add on space as an element, then there is 5 elements. And there is a complex discussion of that, not only in the Abhidhamma, but also in the Uttara Tantra, the sublime continuum as well. And these descriptions or explanations seem to be very similar to the scientific theories of cosmology, explanations. So this is how Buddhism understands the evolution of the physical universe, or one could say the environment. Then when talking about the beings, the sentient beings that inhabit these environments, then of course there is an acceptance of multiplicity of sentient beings within the Buddhist world. So within the realm of the sentient beings, of course, there is an acceptance of sentient beings with corporeal forms and sentient beings who could be perceived as formless. And within even within the sort of our sort of familiar world, in Buddhism, there is an acceptance of diversity of sentient beings, many of which are perceptible to our sensory faculties, and then some which are not so obvious to our sensory faculties. For example, like the spirit world.
Jenny, certainly, deities and spirit So,
generally speaking, in Buddhism, according to Buddhist understanding, that human form is considered to be one of the most ideal forms of existence because of its suitability or because of its conduciveness for practicing Dharma. So compared to the human form of existence, the spirit form would be in fact considered inferior because of its less effectiveness in pursuing the practice of Dharma. Of course, as members of the sort of beings in the spirit world, they may have certain faculties or powers that are not open to us, like certain powers of precognition or maybe some kind of supernatural powers. But the fact remains that there are parts of this world, where human beings also live.
nyumongbe xiangwangje, nyumongwe wangge, gyede bishta chadiyo.
And so all of these sentient beings are under the control of delusions, under the control of afflictive emotions and thoughts. And they are, in some sense, one could say, products of delusions and afflictive thoughts and emotions.
Jeremshik lamzurang je sungshabdi. Shukda chushi gyunjicher. Doga leji chingwa tambyotam. Tangzi chaji tawa bususu. Marimbe masin kunitip. Shen sungshabdi.
Lama Tsongkhapa sort of quite gives a vivid description of the state of being in samsara. So I suppose the unenlightened existence of sentient beings in samsara. He gives the analogy of someone being sort of tied together very tightly by the ropes of karma, negative karma, and delusions, and emotional, afflictive emotions and thoughts, and then put within this and sort of being sort of encased in this net of very tightly bound sort of net of sort of ego consciousness and sort of self-grasping attitudes, and then being sort of thrown around sort of aimlessly by the torrents, sort of, by the currents of fluctuating experiences of suffering and pain. And that is the characteristic of an unenlightened existence. So the question is, if that is the case, what is dukkha? What is the suffering? So Buddhism talks about 3 levels of suffering. One is the suffering of suffering, or one could say obvious sufferings. And the second one is sufferings of change. And the third one is a suffering of conditioning. So when we talk about suffering at the level of the first type, which is the suffering of suffering, we are talking in very conventional terms of experiences that we can all identify as sufferings. These are painful experiences. So when we talk about suffering of suffering, here we are principally talking about, in Buddhism, 4 main experiences of suffering, which are all considered to be fundamentally in the state of being in suffering. These are the suffering of birth, suffering of sickness, and aging, and death. And the significance of the recognition of these states as suffering, or these experiences as suffering, as a kind of an impetus or catalyst towards a spiritual quest, is very strongly demonstrated in Buddha's own personal life story. Buddha, as a Prince Siddhartha, according to the story, is supposed to have seen suffering of a sick person, and an old person, and a dead sort of person being carried away, and these sort of sights is supposed to have led him to the realization that so long as he cannot free himself from this infinite process of rebirth, infinite process of birth, he will always be subject to the other sufferings. So this has led And then seeing a spiritual aspirant is supposed to have led the Buddha to the full recognition or awareness that there is a possibility of a freedom from this cycle of suffering. In Buddhism, there is an understanding that so long as you are subject to the process of rebirth, that all the other sufferings are in some sense kind of natural consequences of that